New Jack City came out in 1991, and it did something that almost no film had done before it. It made a drug lord the most compelling person in the room. Not the hero, not the cop chasing him, the villain. Wesley Snipes walked onto that screen as Nino Brown, and every person in the theater leaned forward. This was not the kind of movie Hollywood had been making about black communities. This was not a redemption story. This was not a cautionary tale wrapped in soft edges. This was raw, it was loud, it was unapologetic, and it hit American audiences like a freight train moving at full speed with nobody at the wheel. The film grossed over $47 million on a budget of $8.5 million. It launched careers. It started conversations. It made people uncomfortable in ways they did not entirely understand. And buried inside that story are 21 facts that most people who have seen the film multiple times still do not know. Some of them will change how you watch the movie. Some of them will change how you think about the era that produced it. All of them are real. So if you have ever quoted this film, watched it twice in one weekend, or felt that something important was being said, even when you could not name exactly what it was, this one is for you. Here is the first thing most people do not know. New Jack City was almost never made. The script spent years in Hollywood limbo because studio executives could not figure out how to market a crime film with an almost entirely black cast to mainstream American audiences. The assumption at the time was that films with black leads had a ceiling. That ceiling was considered a financial reality and not a bias, though those two things were never as separate as the people enforcing the ceiling liked to believe. Director Mario Van Peebles fought for this film repeatedly, and with the kind of sustained determination that most people in his position would have abandoned long before reaching the finish line. He had a vision for it that was specific and unyielding. He wanted something that felt like a black answer to Scarface, something operatic and unsparing, something that treated its characters as full human beings capable of both brilliance and catastrophic moral failure. When Warner Brothers finally agreed to move forward, they gave him a budget that would have barely covered catering on a major studio production. $8.5 million to make a film that would eventually gross nearly 6 times that amount. Van Peebles made it work by shooting fast, by trusting his cast, and by refusing to let the limitations of the budget become the limitations of the film. The second fact is about Wesley Snipes and where Nino Brown actually came from. Snipes has talked in interviews about the specific work he did to build the character from the ground up. He did not want Nino to feel like a cartoon. He did not want him to be the kind of villain you could dismiss because he was too obviously evil. He wanted you to understand the logic of the man even when you despised the choices. Snipes spent time studying real drug kingpins, reading about their psychology, looking at how people who operate outside the law construct systems of loyalty and control that mirror legitimate corporate structures in ways that should make anyone uncomfortable. He also studied Scarface extensively, not to copy it, but to understand what made Tony Montana resonate and then deliberately go in a different direction. Where Montana was explosive and self-destructive from the beginning, Snipes played Nino as a man who was cold, calculating, and completely convinced that what he was doing was a form of empire building. That distinction is what makes Nino Brown terrifying in a way that outlasted the film itself and continues to influence how actors approach villain roles to this day. Fact 3. Ice-T was not originally cast in the film. He was brought in after another actor fell through, and his casting created an immediate tension that actually improved the movie. Ice-T at that point was known primarily as a rapper, and some people on the production were skeptical about whether he could carry dramatic scenes opposite trained actors in high-pressure situations. What those skeptics did not account for was that Ice-T had been telling stories his entire career. Every verse he had written was a character study. Every album was a form of script writing. When he stepped in front of the camera as Scotty Appleton, he brought a specificity to the role that felt lived in rather than performed. There is a scene where Scotty is confronting his own history, wrestling with what his past means for who he is trying to become, and Ice-T plays it with a restraint that most trained actors would have struggled to find. The skeptics went quiet very quickly once they saw the dailies. The fourth fact is about the Harlem locations and what it cost to film there. Van Peebles insisted on shooting in actual Harlem neighborhoods rather than on a lot or in a city that was standing in for New York. This decision was philosophical as much as it was practical. He wanted the environment to be a character. He wanted the walls and the streets and the buildings to carry history that the camera would pick up, even if the audience could not consciously identify it. What he did not fully anticipate was how complicated it would be to manage a film set in a neighborhood that was actively living through the crack epidemic being depicted on screen. There were moments during production where the line between the film and the reality around it became genuinely difficult to navigate. Residents who had lost family members to the drug trade watched scenes being filmed about the drug trade. Some of them became extras. Some of them told the cast things that ended up influencing performances. The weight of that exchange was not lost on anyone involved. Fact 5 involves the infamous chair scene and how it almost did not make it into the final cut. If you have seen the film, you know exactly which scene this is. It is the moment where Nino Brown's hold on the audience becomes something close to hypnotic, even as what he is doing is indefensible. The scene was shot with very little time and a crew that was running behind schedule. Van Peebles made a decision to keep the camera close and let Snipes work with almost no cuts, trusting that the performance would carry what the editing could not. What resulted was a piece of acting that film professors now use in classrooms to talk about the performance of power and the way a camera can implicate its audience simply by not looking away. The studio initially wanted it shortened. Van Peebles pushed back firmly and repeatedly. The scene stayed in the form that you have seen it, and it became one of the most discussed moments in the entire film. The sixth fact is about Chris Rock and the role that changed how Hollywood saw him. Before New Jack City, Rock had done stand-up and had been a cast member on Saturday Night Live, but he had not yet demonstrated that he could disappear into a dramatic role and make people forget they were watching a comedian. His character Pookie is not a comedic character. Pookie is a tragedy. He is a man who is trying to get clean and failing, who is being used by the system he is trying to escape, and whose end lands with a weight that the film does not soften or explain away. Rock has said in interviews that he prepared for the role by talking to people in recovery, by trying to understand the specific texture of addiction rather than his broad strokes. The result is a performance that still holds up because Rock refused to play Pookie as a type. He played him as a person, and you can feel the difference in every single scene he is in. Fact 7. The film was a direct response to what Van Peebles saw as Hollywood's refusal to engage honestly with the crack epidemic. By 1991, crack had been devastating black urban communities for nearly a decade. Network news had covered it. Politicians had given speeches about it. Legislation had been passed with consequences that fell almost entirely on the communities that were already suffering. But American cinema had largely treated crack as a backdrop rather than a subject, as atmosphere rather than as a human catastrophe that required examination. Van Peebles wanted to put the epidemic at the center of a film and make the audience sit with it in a way that a news segment never could. He has described his intention as wanting people to leave the theater and go home and think, not just about what they had seen, but about what they had not been looking at. The film was designed to be uncomfortable. The discomfort was the point and the purpose. The eighth fact is about the soundtrack and how it became almost as influential as the film itself. The New Jack City soundtrack was a document of a specific moment in hip-hop history, capturing artists at the exact moment when the culture was transitioning from one era to another. It featured performers who were at the peak of their powers and others who were about to break wide open into mainstream consciousness. The title track by Color Me Bad became a crossover hit in a way that nobody predicted, and that said something important about what was happening at the intersection of R&B and hip-hop at that moment. Ice-T contributed material that felt like a direct extension of his albums rather than a softened version of his sound designed for a film audience. The soundtrack went platinum, and it is now considered a time capsule of early 90s black music in the way that only a handful of soundtracks from that era can honestly claim. Fact 9 is about Judd Nelson and why his casting was deliberate and not accidental. Nelson was best known at the time for his work in Brat Pack films, specifically The Breakfast Club, and that association was precisely what Van Peebles was interested in exploiting. Casting him as Nick Peretti, a white detective partnered with Ice-T's Scotty, was a choice that Van Peebles made with full awareness of what it would signal to an audience that recognized Nelson from his earlier work. He wanted the partnership between Scotty and Nick to feel uneasy in a productive way. He wanted two men from completely different worlds learning to operate together under pressure without the film pretending that the differences between their worlds did not exist. Nelson committed to the role seriously, working actively to make sure the dynamic felt real rather than like a buddy cop formula grafted onto a more serious film. The scenes between Ice-T and Nelson, where they are genuinely at odds with each other rather than performing a comfortable partnership, are the scenes that hold up best. The 10th fact is about the film's ending and the legal reality that shaped it. Without going into every detail for those who may not remember it precisely, the ending of New Jack City involves a courtroom and a decision that feels both dramatically satisfying and morally complicated in ways that linger after the credits roll. The moral complication was intentional. Van Peebles did not want an ending that told the audience everything was resolved. He wanted an ending that raised questions about systems and accountability and the gap between what justice is supposed to mean and what it actually produces. The specific legal scenario depicted was drawn from real cases that Van Peebles and his writers had researched carefully. Cases where the machinery of the justice system produced outcomes that did not match the weight of what had been done by the people moving through it. The ending divided test audiences sharply. Some wanted something cleaner. Van Peebles kept what he wanted. Fact 11. New Jack City was one of the first studio films to deal explicitly with the economics of the drug trade rather than just its violence. The film spends real time showing how Nino Brown built a business, how he structured it, how he managed loyalty, eliminated risk, and created systems that were designed to survive pressure. This was not glamorization, though some critics at the time read it that way and used that reading to dismiss the film rather than engage with what it was actually doing. It was documentation of a logic that existed regardless of whether cinema acknowledged it. The Cash Money brothers operated with a sophistication that the film portrayed without endorsing, and that distinction required a kind of filmmaking intelligence that a lot of people were not prepared to credit Van Peebles with having. The 12th fact is about a behind-the-scenes conflict that nearly derailed production. There was significant tension during filming between the creative vision of the director and the concerns of the studio about how certain scenes would be received by general audiences and by critics who were already skeptical about the project. The studio wanted more conventional framing around the film's most morally ambiguous moments. They wanted clearer signals to the audience about how to feel at key junctures. Van Peebles resisted this consistently and forcefully. He believed that telling the audience how to feel was a form of condescension that the film could not afford if it was going to accomplish what it was trying to accomplish. This creative standoff was never fully resolved, which is part of why the film has the particular texture it has. It is a film where the commercial and the artistic are in constant friction, and that friction is visible and actually generative in the final product. Fact 13 involves the decision to cast Alan Payne as G-Money, and why that relationship is the emotional engine of the film. Nino and G-Money are childhood friends. Their relationship predates the drug empire. It is the one genuine human connection that Nino Brown has that was formed before power entered the picture and corrupted everything it touched. Watching it deteriorate is the film's real tragedy, because it shows you precisely what Nino has sacrificed to become what he has become, what he has paid for the empire he built. Payne brought a vulnerability to G-Money that made the character sympathetic even when he was making indefensible choices and watching his own situation spiral past the point of recovery. The scenes between Snipes and Payne feel like two people who actually know each other in a way that is very difficult to fake on camera. They prepared for the film by spending time together off-set, building a shared history that the camera would later pick up without needing to explain it through dialogue. The 14th fact is about how New Jack City changed what was possible for black filmmakers in Hollywood in the years that followed. The film's commercial success could not be ignored or reframed as an anomaly. When a film made for $8.5 million earns nearly $48 million in domestic gross, the industry takes notice for reasons that are entirely financial and entirely influential, regardless of the motivations behind that attention. In the years immediately following New Jack City, Hollywood greenlit a wave of films with black directors, black casts, and black stories at the center that would not have been considered commercially viable before the receipts from New Jack City came in. Boys in the Hood came out the same year. Juice came out the following year. Menace 2, Society followed that. New Jack City was not the only reason those films got made, but it was one of the reasons. And the people who made those films understood that. Fact 15 is about the protests that accompanied the film's release and what they actually meant when you look at them honestly. When New Jack City opened, there were incidents in several cities where violence occurred near theaters showing the film. Politicians and commentators blamed the film directly and without qualification. This response followed a pattern that had become familiar. A film depicting black violence was treated as a cause of violence rather than a depiction of something that already existed in the communities where the theaters were located. Van Peebles pushed back on this framing forcefully and consistently in every interview he gave during that period. He pointed out that films depicting white violence did not prompt the same conclusions about what their audiences were capable of. The protests and the discourse around them became a story that overshadowed the film itself for a significant period, which Van Peebles has described as both frustrating and clarifying about exactly what American culture was prepared to see and say. The 16th fact involves Vanessa Williams and how her role shaped the film's treatment of women in the drug economy. Williams played Selena, a woman whose relationship with Nino Brown places her inside a world she did not design, but must navigate with intelligence and constant awareness of her own vulnerability. The film's treatment of her character was more nuanced than a lot of crime films from that era managed to achieve. Selena is not simply a victim, and she is not simply complicit. She is a person making choices inside a set of circumstances that severely limit what choices are actually available to her. Williams fought for that complexity during production and has talked about conversations she had with Van Peebles about making sure Selena's agency remained visible even when her situation was most constricted. Fact 17. The film's budget constraints produced one of its most cinematically distinctive qualities, which is something that almost never happens when you are working with that little money and that much pressure. Because they were shooting fast and moving locations frequently, the camera work in New Jack City has an energy that a more leisurely and well-funded production schedule might have smoothed away into something more conventional. Some of what looks like a bold stylistic choice was actually a practical necessity that Van Peebles and his cinematographer were smart enough to recognize and lean into rather than fight against. Scenes that could not be rehearsed extensively were shot in a way that captured the spontaneous energy of the first take. Dialogue that had to be delivered in a single setup because they were losing light was delivered with an urgency that the script alone could not have manufactured. The limitations became a texture, and that texture became part of what people remember. The 18th fact is about the opening scene and what it established before a single word of dialogue was spoken. The film opens with imagery and atmosphere designed to tell you immediately that you are not watching a conventional crime film from any era you have previously seen. Van Peebles and his cinematographer made choices about color and framing in those opening moments that were influenced by music videos as much as by traditional cinema. This was intentional and considered. Hip-hop was the dominant cultural language of the community the film was depicting, and Van Peebles wanted the film's visual grammar to reflect that inheritance rather than borrow the visual language of films made by and for different communities. The result was something that felt genuinely new in 1991. The opening of New Jack City was unlike anything that had been in American theaters before it. Fact 19 is about a scene that was filmed and then cut entirely from the final release. The scene involved a confrontation that Van Peebles felt was important for understanding Nino's psychology and the internal logic of the character's decisions, but that the studio felt slowed the film's momentum in its second act at a point where it needed to accelerate rather than pause. The disagreement about the scene was significant enough that it delayed the final cut for several weeks, while both sides worked through the argument. Van Peebles has indicated in subsequent interviews that he believes the film suffers slightly from its absence, that there is a gap in the characterization of Nino Brown in the middle of the film that the deleted scene would have filled in ways that would have made the ending land even harder. For those who care deeply about the film, this is one of the most compelling reasons to hope that a proper archival release with deleted material becomes possible. The 20th fact is about how the film was received critically at the time of its release versus how it is understood and written about now. In 1991, the critical response to New Jack City was genuinely mixed and sometimes openly condescending. Some reviewers recognized immediately that something significant had been made and tried to describe why in language that was equal to the task. Others were dismissive in ways that clearly reflected assumptions about who the film was for and what films about Black communities were capable of achieving or saying. Time has settled that debate completely. New Jack City now appears regularly on lists of the most important American films of the 1990s. It is taught in film schools and cultural studies programs. It is cited by filmmakers whose work has nothing to do with the crime genre as an influence on how they think about storytelling, camera work, and the relationship between cinema and the social conditions it depicts. And the 21st fact is perhaps the most important one, because it is the one that ties everything else together and explains why a film made in 1991 on $8.5 million is still being watched and written about and argued over. New Jack City was made by people who understood that they were making something that would outlast them. Mario Van Peebles knew it. Wesley Snipes knew it. Ice-T knew it. Chris Rock, who had a relatively small role, understood that he was part of something that would be referenced long after the immediate conversation had moved on. The care that went into every element of that production, despite the limited budget, despite the studio resistance, despite the protests and the controversy and the critical dismissals, was the care of people who were determined to leave something behind that told a truth that was not being told anywhere else. And that is exactly what they did. The film is more than 30 years old, and it still tells that truth with the same force it had when it first opened. You can still feel the weight of it in every scene. You can still watch the courtroom and feel the specific unease of a system producing the outcome it produces. The film refuses to let you look away, and that refusal is a gift, even when it is a deeply uncomfortable one. 21 facts about a film that changed American cinema and that most people who have seen it still do not fully understand. If you made it to the end of this, you already know more about New Jack City than 90% of people who count it among their favorites. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the films that actually mattered. Drop a comment below and tell me which fact landed hardest for you. And if you know someone who thinks they know everything about this film, send them this video. They do not know everything. Now they can.